All right, chapter 12 and 13, evolution. We're going to try to get through this. What is evolution? Basically, evolution is just change over time. There are certain pressures, selection pressures, placed upon animals. They have to try to find enough food, cover, mating partners, shelter, etc. And they're all competing for it. And they are trying to pass their genes on to the next generation. Now, several things, the natural selection items will interfere and drive evolution, because as environments change, animals have to adapt. And over time, these adaptations, basically it's just a selection of which genes get expressed physically in the organism, and mutations occur, and this leads to evolution. Recall, a population is a group of interbreeding organisms of the same species. Evolution occurs in species, not individuals. Okay, and it has to do with different alleles of a gene. Remember, alleles are basically versions of a gene. And some alleles will give advantages, some alleles can give disadvantages. Some alleles that give advantages today may give disadvantages tomorrow. Remember also, evolution is a scientific theory. Okay, so a scientific theory is a hypothesis that the majority of scientists accept as fact. Okay, it's not the same as a theory when people use it in common usage. In common usage, they use the word theory as a synonym for hypothesis. Okay? Hypothesis is just a possible explanation for an observed phenomenon. Now, in science, we operate on a paradigm called naturalistic. If we observe it, we can figure out how it happened. Anything that happens in the natural world has a natural explanation. To be scientific, a hypothesis must be testable. Evolution is a scientific theory. That means there's a lot of evidence to support it. And we're going to talk about some of those types of evidence. But first, let's take a little look at evolutionary thought and how it got started. A lot of people, think that Darwin was the first scientist to actually start talking about changes over time, and that's not accurate. If you read the writings of Aristotle, he addressed what he called fixity of species. And he said, species are identical and never change. However, later in the 1700s, Count Buffon started noticing that species change as they spread from their original location. And he did this because at the time he was writing a book about the different species. He was in Europe. And he noticed that what are considered the same species from different parts of Europe looked pretty different. And so that's when he's the first one to really talk about species changing over time gradually. Lamarck talked about species changing, but he didn't understand the method. He didn't understand how it was being done. And he said new species come from existing species through environmental forces. So, for instance, he talked about giraffes. And he said giraffes would change over time because they would stretch their necks. And their whole life, these giraffes would stretch their necks trying to get to higher and higher leaves. And so as their necks got longer during their lifespan, when they had offspring, the offspring would just have longer necks. Now, this was disproven because what he's talking about are acquired characteristics. These are characteristics that you acquire over the course of your lifetime, and these aren't passed to the next generation. It's very easy to disprove this. You could take a mouse, and according to Lamarck, if you cut off the mouse's tail and let it breed, its babies would have no tail. And that's obviously not true. So he was discredited. Now, Lyell was the first person to really start looking at rocks and geology. He kind of founded geology. And he said that all changes in nature are gradual, and he was the first one to even start talking about the age of the Earth being older than we originally thought. Then you come up with Darwin and Wallace. Darwin and Wallace were both, through letters, developing the idea of evolution. However, neither one of them wanted to really publish it because they were afraid of fallout for contradicting the religious viewpoint of how organisms came to be. Let's see here. Linnaeus. Linnaeus is the person that invented taxonomy, and he believed in fixity of species. And he was in conflict with Count Buffon. Carolus Linnaeus, he changed his name, he Latinized it, and he developed the names of, like, Homo sapiens. And he started naming species. Cuvier started using comparative anatomy to develop a system of classification. He is the first one to seriously study fossil organisms, and he proposed what was called catastrophism. He said catastrophes had caused later strata to have a new mix of fossils, because we noticed when we looked at fossils in layers, you'd have different species represented in each layer. And so his idea was that a catastrophe would occur, and a lot of the species would die and be replaced by new species using the same resources. And this was pretty radical thought back during his time, the late 1800s. Lyell, we talked about him, we talked about Lamarck. Now, there is Charles Darwin at 31. He was a young gentleman of England, and he served the empire as a naturalist, and he took a voyage on a scientific expedition called the Beagle. It was a scientific expedition of exploration, and it circumnavigated the globe. It left England, went down into South America, around the tip of South America, which at that time in a sailing vessel was pretty dangerous. He came up, he landed in the Galapagos Islands, he crossed over into the Pacific now, and he landed in New Zealand, Australia, up to some of the islands in the Indian Ocean, South Africa, and then back to South America and back to England. It took a couple years. These links are basically little links to clips from a movie on his life, and if you're interested in watching that movie, let me know, and I'll be glad to send you a link. I have a copy of it on my YouTube channel. It's just private. It's only for use for my students. Now, he had been reading the geological observations of Lyell and then later Hutton, who was inspired by Lyell, and he started making these biogeographical observations. He noticed that life on Earth in different areas would have animals that fulfilled the same role in one place as in another place, but they were different species. And this was due to their isolation. This is what he hypothesized. He basically thought these species could be modified according to the science and the environment. So here's Darwin. Now, it's interesting to note, Darwin started developing his hypothesis of evolution, but he waited till almost the end of his life to publish it. He published a couple different books. There was Origin of Species, and which he didn't even touch on the evolution of humans. And then he wrote a second book almost just before his death that did speculate on humans evolving. That one was really pretty radical, and there were people calling for his head at that point. In the early 1900s was when we first started getting information on radioactivity, and some of the first great scientists in investigating radioactivity were females, were women. And at the same time as Darwin was writing, etc., this is when the science of genetics arose. Mendel was a priest in Austria, and he worked out basic genetics, which we did in lab. And he didn't understand a lot of them, and he didn't understand chromosomes. He didn't know they existed, but he knew that there was something that cells were carrying and organisms were carrying that could be translated and transferred. And then there were some things that had methods of transmission that he couldn't figure out, which took later years to do. And he did his work and published, and then everybody promptly forgot about it because he published it in an obscure Austrian journal. And then in 1900, his laws were rediscovered, and some of these people started discovering in 1915, because we had good microscopes back then, we started seeing things like chromosomes and mapping genes onto chromosomes. And they took Mendel's work and took it much further. And between these different radioactivity and isotopes, we figured out that certain minerals give off radiation, and the radiation is caused by elements breaking down into other elements. And so all of these sources started putting together and forming into this modern evolutionary synthesis. And this is when we really started working seriously on studying evolution. Okay? What came later, Watson and Crick in the 60s or 50s rather, discovered DNA. Plate tectonics, we figured out that there are plates on the crust of the Earth that are moving around. Every plate on this planet is moving, albeit by somewhere like an inch a year. We started classifying life into various domains. Now, this was in my lifetime. When I was in college as an undergrad, domains had not been adopted. They had been proposed, okay, in 1977, but they weren't adopted till a little later, and so our professors didn't teach us about domains. The highest classification we had was kingdom. This couple, Peter and Rosemary Grant, started doing work on Darwin's finches and documenting evolution and doing it with genetics rather than just observation. In the 80s and 90s, we started doing large-scale gene sequencing. When I was in grad school, we could do little small chunks of DNA and test them. And ongoing research is going, and now we've got a developmental biology that is the latest thing that has taken the science even further and provided more evidence. Now understand that through all of this time, starting with Darwin, all the scientists working on all this material were trying to prove evolution wrong. But when they ran their experiments, the data showed that it wasn't wrong. Okay, and that's an important thing to remember. These people weren't trying to prove evolution, they were actually trying to disprove it. And they failed. Genetics, basically a population has a gene pool. Okay, the same species, any organism in the same species has a gene pool, and the gene pools can vary from region to region, but you're still the same species, because the biological species concept is that if you can reproduce viable offspring, you're in the same species. Now, in certain regions, we'll find different gene pools, but there is starting to become more gene flow between the gene pools. And that's going to affect how future generations look. Here's the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. This is kind of the math behind evolution. This basically is an equation. If you look at the genetics, the gene locations on animals or an organism, the frequency of homozygous plus 2 times the frequency of the heterozygous genotype, frequency of homozygous recessive genotype. If you plug in these numbers, you will always get 1. Okay? So this is heterozygous. This is homozygous dominant. Notice they're capital letters. and this is homozygous recessive. All right, and you square that. This is a mathematical formula. And if you look at a species and say, okay, this is how many, this is the percentage of genes in their genotype that is homozygous dominant. And you square that number plus 2 times that number times the number of the percentage of homozygous recessive genotypes plus the percentage of homozygous genotypes squared equals 1. Now, I don't expect you to figure this out. This is, or even calculate a problem, so don't panic. But what it says is, if there is no such thing as evolution, and the evolution it's referring to is if gene frequencies in populations never vary and always stay the same, the equation will always come up to 1. All right, let me say that again. If there's no such thing as evolution, meaning that no genes frequency, how many of the organisms in the gene pool have that gene or allele, the equation will always equal 1. Unfortunately, every species we've ever tested, and we've done that, we run a genome sample from a species, and then we map the gene, and we figure out percentages of all these numbers, and then we do it again next year. It's always different, and so it never equals 1. Okay, so this was somebody's attempt to try to prove that evolution was false, and unfortunately it didn't work out that way. The Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium model, theorem, law, whatever you want to call it, states that allele and genotype frequencies in a population will always remain constant from generation to generation in the absence of other evolutionary influences. Things like mate choice, mutation, selection, genetic drift, gene flow, meiotic drive. Meiotic drive refers to undergoing meiosis and random selection of the chromosomes that get into the eggs and sperm of the organisms. Now, here's the thing. Scientists test it against a null hypothesis. We state that allele frequencies don't change from one generation to the next. That's the hypothesis that we're testing with Hardy-Weinberg. So we collect the percentages of each allele and genotype, and we measure it. Okay? It will equal 1 after we plug in numbers for every letter here. And the letters just correspond to the frequency of an allele. Okay? And we get a 1 if those frequencies never change, meaning they always have the same percentage of dominant or recessive alleles. So like in this case, you can see this is one trait. There's a homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, heterozygous. The number of individuals that if we count here and count up all the homozygous dominants, all the homozygous recessives, and all the heterozygous ones, and we find X number of each, every generation we're going to find the same number of each one of these animals. Okay? That means that gene pools never change. Unfortunately, we've never found that. So, basically it says all of the following assumptions that you have to make if evolution isn't real. First, natural selection doesn't occur. There's nothing in the environment that affects the gene frequency in a population. Mutations do not occur. The population's large enough to get rid of random changes in allele frequency, so it has to be a pretty good population. The individuals made at random. There is absolutely no selection pressure on what females find most fit in choosing males, and there's no migration into or out of the population. So if all these occur, then evolution is false. All right? And there you go. This gives you the definitions of each variable. And we just don't see it in translation. Okay, so for evolution to be false, the following things can occur. Nothing can affect how you choose your mate. DNA mutations never occur. Genetic drift. Genetic drift is some alleles get lost or some alleles are acquired. There's no migration of individuals into or out of populations, bringing in new alleles or taking alleles out of the population. There's no selection pressures whatsoever. And so everything always stays the same. And unfortunately, for those who do not like evolution, none of these are true. We have ample evidence from ample number of experiments to show that these are in fact false. Okay? Allele frequency is calculated by the following equation. You just take the number of copies of an allele divided by the total number of alleles for the same gene in the population. So this is how you would get these numbers down here. So for this population, the first year, this allele A was in 70% of the population, and this one was in 30%. The next generation, 60-40. There was a shift in frequency of alleles in the population. First generation, second generation, we're seeing a change. Okay? And what could cause, let's take this group, what could cause this change? Now, being green as an insect in this environment means that you have a better chance of survival. That's why it's in 75% of the population. Being brown would make you stand out, but for some reason we start seeing it shift. Being brown starts to become more advantageous. And here is a side-by-side picture of the same habitat about 10 years apart. So being green is great when you have this lush grass, but when you experience severe drought, being green is going to single you out and you'll get eaten very quickly. All right. Here's another picture, same way, 10 years apart. This is normal and this was a drought. So we see that habitats change over time. There's a lot of ways to change habitats. You could plow over and drain all that and put up condos. That would change the habitat. Okay? Chemistry. For evolution to be real, we have to know the age of the Earth and the universe. Evolution takes a lot of generations for a species, especially vertebrates, who have slow reproduction rates comparatively, to change over time. And we do it primarily through radiometric dating. This measures the half-life of a chemical element that breaks down into another element over time. Example of radiometric dating, this is carbon-14, okay? And basically, carbon-14 is a byproduct of metabolism. And so while you're alive, you are constantly making carbon-14 from carbon-12, and the amount of carbon-14 in your body at any point in time is always the same. And it's going to be the same as your neighbor and your friend and your enemy. We all have the same amount, or the tree, or the bug on the tree, or the bird in the tree. We all have the same amount of carbon-14 as a percentage while we're alive. When we die, carbon-14 leaves the system. And it leaves as a gas, nitrogen-14. And we have calculated by measuring how fast it leaves. It takes 5,730 years for half the carbon-14 to be broken down in your bone or any other organic material, okay, to 50%. So I've got 5,730 years. And at 5,000, so if I take this bone sample and I measure the amount of carbon-14 and it has half as much as it should have, then I know that's 5,730 years old. Okay? So throughout our life, we constantly accumulate it, and it stays the same, and then it decays. So if I go in there and I find a bone, and I measure it, and it's only got 25% of the carbon-14 that it should have when it was alive, Well, the first half left, it's 5,730 years old, and then I'm at 50%. Okay, so now the next half leaves. Whoops, sorry. And it takes 5,730 years to go from 50% to 25%. And it would take another 5,730 years for it to go from 25% to 12.5%. And so you can calculate how old organic matter is. Now, you can't use this on rocks, but you can use this on organic material. And the reason we use this as our example is because we're only dealing with 5,730 years instead of millions of years for a lot of the other radioactive elements that we use. So if I said, okay, there's only 50% of the carbon-14 it should have, I know it's 5,700 years old, or 5,730. If it has 25%, I know it's now, let's see, that's 10, 11, 4, 11,460 years, because 5,730 times 2 is 11,460 years old, etc. And so you just, the less carbon-14 you can calculate against the standard, and you will figure out exactly how old this thing is. All right? Let's see. A lot of people will try to say that radiometric dating is false, or it's flawed, or it doesn't work. But what you're saying, when you're saying that, is that nuclear theory is false, meaning we don't really have nuclear reactors. We don't have nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We don't have a problem storing nuclear wastes until they can break down and be safe. We don't have any of the medical technologies related to nuclear theory. Okay? If radiometric dating doesn't work, then none of these other things work. And that means there's a giant conspiracy and we're faking all that medicine, which I don't think is really true. When you say chemical and absolute dating doesn't work or is false, you are saying that chemical theory, the periodic table, and the chemical constants are not real. That means you can't take medications, because in order for these calculations to be wrong, every calculation has to be wrong, because these calculations are based upon the periodic table and how individual elements interact. Okay? And by interacting, what I'm saying is how they react to each other, because each chemical reaction is in essence just a mathematical calculation. Okay? So chemistry either works or it doesn't. You don't get to say, okay, I like medicine, so it works for that, but I don't like evolution, so it can't work for that. Okay? They're both based upon the exact same principles and facts. All right, this is the first half. We're at about 30 minutes. I'm going to stop it and make this